Good morning or good afternoon, everyone, depending on where you are in the United States. Welcome to today's quarterly webcast that's designed to keep board and board compliance committee members apprised of important compliance matters. This is Susan Shiflett on behalf of Michelle Cooper, who is CHI's Senior VP and Corporate Responsibility Officer. Michelle was not able to be with us today. So today's webcast is, the topic of today's webcast is an update on recent activities, risks, and challenges related to HIPAA. Our speakers are Ram Ramadas, Vice President for CRP, responsible for privacy, information security, and electronic health record oversight, as well as Lori Lamb, who is CHI's Director and National Privacy Officer. Today's webcast is planned for an hour, and it is being recorded. The link to access the recording will be distributed later this week. We encourage you to submit questions throughout the presentation, and the questions will be addressed at the end of today's presentation. And the way that you submit a question is when you signed in to today's webcast, there is a chat box that you should be able to see when you logged in, and you will type your question in there, and we will monitor that throughout the webcast and address them at the end of the presentation. So before we get started, I wanted to share the following prayer. So if everybody could just center themselves in the presence of their God. Dear God, we commit this working day to you. May we engage with each task with faith and perseverance. May we manage each situation with wisdom and value. May we speak and serve with integrity and purpose. Lord, we invite you to work within us today. Amen. So with that, I'm going to turn it over to Ram Ramadas and Lori Lamb.
Thank you so much, Susan. This is Ram Ramadas. We have two different topics to cover during our session today. Lori Lamb is going to cover privacy risks and challenges, and I will cover information security risks and challenges. If you look at, we have three key objectives for today's session. We would like to provide you with an update on recent Office for Civil Rights HIPAA activity. Office for Civil Rights is a watchdog or one of the major regulatory agencies for all the HIPAA compliance activities. You're going to hear OCR multiple times during the presentation. We also would like to talk about some emerging security risks and challenges. And finally, we would like to end with some key takeaways for board governance, especially when you're dealing with HIPAA privacy and security activities.
Thank you, Ram. So we're going to begin talking about the privacy world in HIPAA, and all of us in healthcare have been dealing with HIPAA for quite some time. But there's been an extraordinary amount of activity in calendar year 2016, really beginning in the waning months of 2015. And why the change, since HIPAA has been around for quite some time? Well, the Office of the Inspector General, the OIG, which I'm sure you as board members have also heard about, conducted their own evaluation of the Office of Civil Rights in July and August of 2015, and they issued a report in September of 2015, and the title of the report was very telling. It is that the OCR should strengthen its oversight of covered entity compliance with HIPAA standards. That really said it all in a nutshell. And in essence, the report found that the OCR, the Office of Civil Rights, really was primarily reactive and was not being effective in providing sound and thorough oversight of covered entities' application of the HIPAA privacy and security rule. I think this also was born out of a number of large healthcare breaches that I'm sure you're also familiar with in the past couple of years. So the OIG made several very stern recommendations to the OCR and put them in writing. Those being that the OCR was to fully implement the required HIPAA audit program that was statutorily outlined in the HITECH Rule of 2010. Second, the OCR needed to substantially increase HIPAA-related education to covered entities so that they could be well informed. Third, the OCR needed to better identify trends and history of noncompliance at specific covered entities. They currently do evaluate large breaches, but they needed to do a better job of looking at trends instead of looking at breaches in a vacuum. And much of the activity that we have seen this year from the OCR has stemmed from these recommendations in this report. So let's speak a bit about the OCR Phase 2 HIPAA audits. So subsequent to the report, you'll note that was the first recommendation. The OCR did get busy, and in November of 2015, they announced to covered entities, and that is we as healthcare providers, that they were going to begin conducting numerous Phase 2 HIPAA audits for covered entities and business associates. Now, the purpose of these audits was multi-focused. First, it was to provide an opportunity to conduct desk audits and some on-site audits at covered entities to determine their compliance with the HIPAA rule. Just as a quick reminder, HIPAA has been in place, the privacy rule, since 2003, and the security rule since 2005. So the OCR, in their opinion, and in the OIG's opinion, has given the industry ample time to come into compliance with the statutory requirements. They felt like 11 and 13 years was adequate. So they're going to begin these desk and on-site audits. Secondly, they wanted to identify gaps in the HIPAA program application. The rule is somewhat complex. Some areas of it are very dictatorial, and some are very gray. So they wanted to identify gaps within the industry of how the rule is being applied. Subsequent to that gap identification, the OCR is going to develop and has been developing more specific education to identify these gaps and give covered entities some tools and some guidance on how they can better apply the rule. And they always reserve the right to take enforcement action if they find any egregious violations subsequent to these audits. So, anytime you let an auditor see your world, there's always that risk. So CHI, of course, we immediately, upon notification that the OCR audits would begin, we immediately put together a plan and assembled multiple teams to prepare for these potential OCR audits. The OCR posted an audit protocol that was quite lengthy. It was 1,500 line items that they pulled straight from the law. We reviewed this protocol. We divided it up between privacy and security into applicable components. And Ron's going to speak a little bit about the security applications and preparation. But from the privacy and contract business associate perspective, we began assembling documentation to meet the actual line items of the protocol components. The desk audits themselves will be an incredibly short turnaround. If you get chosen, you have 10 days, and only 10 days, to respond with the documents. So we began very proactively planning. We reviewed and updated all privacy policies and standards such that they were well positioned to answer any of the audit questions. We coordinated very closely and are continuing to coordinate with our health information management vendors and departments. Much of the privacy component of the protocol deals with how we as organizations respond to a patient's request under various HIPAA rights. And the health information department, by releasing and amending medical records, they are a key player in this, and so we've coordinated very carefully with them. Further, we felt like it would be really helpful if we had some semblance of mock audit done in each market. Now, we certainly could not do a mock audit at every location, but Chan partnered with us, and we chose one location in each market, usually a bigger or a complex location, and they conducted mock audits using the actual OCR protocol and shared with us responses, and we've identified gaps and are working on responses to those. Another huge piece of preparation was that we inventoried and assembled a list of business associate agreements for each of the locations that we have that were in the audit pool. And this was quite a task to pull this together because it cuts across both national, regional, and local business associate agreements. And it was an item that the OCR told us they would demand from us upon notification. And a great deal of work has gone into that. The security preparation, Ron?
Thank you, Lori. So when it comes to security, there are 70 security controls in the OCR audit protocol. So IT security, they work with the corporate responsibility and different business leaders and different IT teams to identify specific evidence of compliance and also pull together the set of policies, procedures, and education material related to HIPAA compliance program. We also made sure that we conducted risk assessments and focused on some of the mitigation activities across different facilities. When we went through this exercise, we identified gaps with the 3 program areas. One is business continuity and IT disaster recovery. The second one is newly acquired entities, and the third one is physical security program. I'm going to talk about business continuity and disaster recovery program during my presentation, but what we have done once we identified the gaps, we started working with the business leaders and the leaders who are responsible for physical security, business continuity, and disaster recovery to make sure that they close the gaps and start addressing some compensating controls for this area.
Thank you, Ron. Now, we spoke a second ago about business associates and preparing business associate agreements. Business associates are vendors and partners that covered entities, which are we as healthcare providers, share, send, or work with protected health information. We ask them to do a function for us. Sometimes it's billing, sometimes it's consulting. Much in the IT world, platform enhancement, our EMRs, these are all our business associates. So there are a lot of business associates engaged in the healthcare industry. And the Office of Civil Rights, in addition to focusing on covered entities, also feels this year a strong need to focus on business associates and their activities, to the degree that they have and will be including business associates in their Phase 2 audits. They have stated and gone on record saying they're going to audit 40 to 50 business associates in this first wave of audits. And I've not heard of any actively being done yet, but they were targeting November, December for that time frame. In addition to really engaging directly with business associates for the audit, this year there have been several enforcement actions that have resulted in findings and fines against business associates or related to a covered entity's relationship with its business associates. And you can see here I've listed some of those and the dollar amounts associated with the respective fines. The most common finding and fine usually is related to the lack of a risk assessment of the security rule and the security systems, and a lack of proper mitigation efforts for gaps and problems identified. And they have come down on business associates and covered entities pretty stiffly here. You'll note, there's a $5.5 million, so there's quite a bit of money at stake here. Recently, since the summer, there's been additional activities where the OCR has fined covered entities for a failure to have proper business associate agreements in place. Now, business associate agreements are legal documents that we have to have in place with our partners. They typically marry to our underlying contract or agreement, and they outline the requirements that the business associate has to follow when they are using or disclosing our PHI. But we must have this document in place when we are sharing. And when they find covered entities that do not have these documents in place, and the failure of that has resulted in a breach, then they are fining the covered entities. The most recent fine that came out actually last month was the failure of a covered entity to update their business associate agreement post-2013. A quick comment about that. In 2013, the HIPAA rule changed slightly, and they added some enhancements, added some additional components to the rule, and they compelled covered entities to update all of their business associate agreements. You could either send out an entirely new document, or you could do it by amendment. There was a variety of ways to do it, but you absolutely had to do this. They gave the industry a full calendar year with a hard stop of September 2014, and frankly, probably gave grace into 2015. But recently there was an event that resulted in a breach of patient information, and when the OCR investigated, they found the business associate agreement had not been updated since 2005, and thus they rendered this fine. So we, of course, stay very attuned to what the OCR is doing, and we began in 2013 with much work, again, updating our business associate agreement then. But more assertively, we have recently partnered with legal, because remember I said these agreements need to be married and tied to your underlying contract. So we've recently partnered with legal and IT security to really mitigate our BAA risks in several ways. And we have an initiative where we are developing new BA templates that really are streamlined. They have in them what the law requires, and they really have in them what we need as a covered entity. But we don't have 20 different templates. We are also centralizing the BAA redline review process. Of course, when we are in negotiations with the partner, there's often a back and forth and a redlining of both contracts and business associate agreements. And we partner very closely with legal, and we can determine what parts of the BA we are comfortable redlining and what we cannot. We are also being much more proactive in mitigating identified risks by working with these BA negotiations. We get on calls and we talk with our vendors, and we try to explain and educate. So we're trying to be very proactive so that we do not find ourselves in a situation where we are vulnerable along the lines of what you saw on the previous slide. And we are also establishing an ongoing supplier risk management program that Ram is going to speak about more in his part of the presentation. So another area where we've seen a good deal of activity from the OCR, remember I spoke about the OIG felt they needed to better track and trend events. The OCR is pretty good about tracking and doing demand investigations on large breaches, those involving greater than 500 patients. But historically, they've not paid a lot of attention to smaller breaches. And so they did announce officially in August of 2016 that they were going to start more vigorously investigating smaller breaches, those of less than 500. And I'll be honest, we've seen them begin to investigate breaches around 250, 300, even 150. So their investigations, they stated, are going to focus on similar events within the same entity if you have repeat events, or if they can tell that you are not addressing patterns of risks within your organization that are tied to or result in breaches. So they at least said, hey folks, this is what we're going to look at. So we at CHI, of course, we've always done this, but we were able to enhance our program. So what are we doing to get ahead of this risk? We already, and have been for over 2 years, track every privacy event in this organization, large or small, and its related causative factors. And we are taking that information, analyzing it, and looking for trends as they're going to start doing. And we're trying to work with the key stakeholders on the ground to improve some of these processes, understanding that every day is a busy day for the staff in the world, and they are handling a lot of patient care and a lot of PHI in their roles. But we're working closely to help improve processes so that we can drive down the volume and frequency of these low-volume breach events. And focusing a lot on what can we put in place from a technical and physical safeguard, which tends to be more IT-driven. Administrative safeguards derive from education and policies, and they depend on human behavior, which is important. But we all can make mistakes, honest, innocent ones, and if we can put technical safeguards in place, that's an additional barrier. So what does all of this new activity from the OCR mean to the covered industry entities and to the healthcare industry? Well, it certainly, in all honesty, has been a game changer this year. It has resulted in quite a large increased risk of the actual engagement of the OCR at and or with covered entities, both from an audit perspective and from an increase in on-demand investigations. As a result of the changes in the 2013 law, that I'm not going to go into great detail here, every privacy event, large or small, must be investigated and documented. And this increases the resource demands to the privacy officers, particularly now that the OCR has stated they're going to start looking more closely at these smaller events. It requires all of these guidances that come out, and these stances requires frequent updating of our policies and standards. We need to keep those policies and standards in line with both the statutes and the espoused expectations of the OCR. Subsequent to those, it increases our need for frequent and ongoing education to all stakeholders in a variety of ways that we can keep things in the fore of people's minds. Of course, this activity can increase the risk of OCR fines and other sanctionable actions if we do have a problem, and it definitely increases the cost to us to mitigate these events, whether it's technically or in after the fact credit monitoring, but it certainly is increasing the cost to mitigate them, especially as we look at technical and physical safeguards that can end run to these events. Just wanted to show you a brief comparison for context. Again, the OCR is the government authority that has jurisdiction over HIPAA, privacy, and security. They do have the right, and they do render fines and sanctions on a regular basis. So you can see here, this is data I pulled through the end of October. So this is January through October. There have been 12 enforcement actions by the OCR against covered entities and business associates that have resulted in fines. 5 of those involve BAs that we talked about. This is the real kicker here. The fines from January through October 31st for this year so far total $22.8 million. And please note that last year for the entire year, their total fines were only $6.2 billion. So they have ratcheted up their activity. They have found a revenue stream, and they, because they're under the gun from the OIG, and they're going to continue this. The enforcements obviously are increasing in both frequency and amount. They're putting out, with the 9 months, 12, they're putting out more than 1 a month. So it really has been quite a change in the privacy and security environment this year, quite different from what we've seen in some time.
Thank you so much, Lori. Let us focus on key security risks and challenges faced by healthcare organizations. I would like to start with a quote from the Commissioner for Securities and Exchange Commission, Luis Aguilar. During his speech in 2014, he urged boards to sharpen their focus on cybersecurity risks. The quote is, "Boards that choose to ignore or minimize the importance of cybersecurity oversight responsibility do so at their own peril." Definitely, cybersecurity is becoming a boardroom priority. So let us talk about some of the security challenges unique to the healthcare sector. If you look at healthcare industry, we have been going through a lot of evolution. If you look at 5 years back, majority of our healthcare organizations were still operating with paper records. Even today, there are a lot of physician practices and even small hospitals, they still manage with paper records. But I think there has been a fast growth in terms of adoption of electronic systems. So that is a huge change happening in the healthcare sector. But the most important is the protected health information. If you look at the data in the healthcare industry, it includes fundamental, unchanging facts about a patient. So think about a credit card or a bank account. If a credit card is lost or stolen, it's easy for the credit card companies to issue a new card, or they can cover some of the fraudulent expenses with a bank account. But when you talk about a patient data and privacy, the privacy is lost. Once the data is lost or stolen, there is no damage control we can do other than providing some level of identity theft protection and some financial damages. The second major thing is the average security breach cost for healthcare record versus other industries. If you look at in healthcare, it costs $363 per record compared to $154 per record in other industries. It's more than double. So if you lose one patient record, this is a minimum cost that we are talking about. It does not include all the fines that Lori is talking about from OCR fines and resolution agreements. Again, the cost can only go up. In 2015, more than 113 million patients were affected by breaches. It was a huge year from security breaches. In fact, if we go back and look at from 2010 to 2014, the number of breaches were 1/4 of the breaches we have seen in 2015 alone. We all remember the breach we had with the Anthem. Anthem breach contributed to a significant number here. Almost 70 million patients were affected by Anthem security breach. So if you look at why the criminals are going after healthcare industry, there are three main factors. One is identity theft. If you look at any PHI or patient record, you have social security number, you have names, addresses, date of birth. So it gives them an opportunity for potential identity theft and also exploitation of insurance. This is a huge thing that is happening, and also prescription drug benefits. So this, if you look at the healthcare industry, combined with some of the challenges they have from the security controls, because of the breach cost, because of the information that we carry, it definitely, the industry has been a focus from malicious users. The one more key area, if you look at healthcare organizations, they have been focusing more on compliance-based approach. They've been taking more of a HIPAA compliance-based controls. But when you think about HIPAA compliance, it provides you with a minimum set of controls, but each organization has different set of risks depending upon where they are located, what type of data they handle, what type of systems they have. They have to take more of risk management based approach in addressing security programs. We are all familiar with Hollywood Presbyterian Hospital. In February, hackers seized control of the system, and in fact, nearly 2 weeks, they were not able to access their electronic health record system. The clinicians and the staff had to go back to a manual process in terms of accessing and managing the patients. They were able to access only the phones and fax machines, and after 2 weeks, they paid a ransom amount of $15,000, and they were able to get back to their systems and access. If you look at this event, in fact, increased the awareness among the healthcare companies, especially when you see from medical devices perspective. If you look at all the pacemakers, insulin pumps, most of these devices are electronic devices, and they all connect to the wireless network, they connect to the internet. So think about the compromise that could happen from these kind of attacks coming from malicious users. It could potentially lead to some patient safety issues. So again, the underlying theme is the system may be HIPAA compliant, but still the system may be at a greater risk. And in this case, again, the Hollywood Presbyterian Hospital system, they're very likely HIPAA compliant, but they could not, and they did not prevent the recent attack. So let us talk about ransomware for a moment. Most of you heard about this particular term. and it's definitely gained a lot of popularity among healthcare organizations. If you look at the number of daily ransomware attacks since early 2016, we had 4,000 attacks in the United States. If we compare it to 2015, we had only 1,000 daily ransomware attacks. It's 300% increase in terms of the number of attacks that are happening, and definitely healthcare has been under a lot of focus. So what is a ransomware? Ransomware is nothing but a distinct malicious software, and what it does is once it attacks a system or a user, it takes control of the data. It encrypts the entire data. The users and the companies, they lose access to the data, and unless they pay the ransom, they will not be able to access their system and data. Huge risk, right? When you see from the risk perspective, definitely there is a huge risk from the patient care. If a company is faced with some ransomware attacks, definitely for a period of time, they will not be able to provide patients with a sufficient level of care because they cannot access the data or they cannot access the systems. The other aspect is, if for some reason, if these ransomware attacks cause some impact to the data, and if you cannot recover that data, if you do not have proper data backup for these systems, you may lose patient data, and ultimately you may not be able to provide continuity of care to our patients. So, and then once the incident happens, OCR, they require companies to conduct a detailed risk assessment to determine the low probability and see if the ransomware has caused any kind of data leakage, if the ransomware has inappropriately modified the data, or there is any kind of a disclosure. So if it is, then you have to engage some kind of third-party forensic companies, and you may have to engage some security experts to go through a very detailed assessment. Again, significant resources in terms of the breach response perspective. Again, it may lead to potential reporting to patients and also OCR. So are there mitigation controls available? Absolutely. In fact, ransomware is a symptom. It is if the organizations, if they focus on cyber hygiene, if they continue to do the right things in terms of patching their systems, they can maintain solid controls in preventing these ransomwares into their systems. The second most important thing is employee awareness. All it takes is one employee, one user to bring some kind of a phishing attack into the system. If their system is compromised, then immediately they could introduce any kind of a virus or malware into the entire system. Whenever we talk about ransomware or malicious software, we have to think about recovery efforts. No company is immune to these kind of security attacks, but what is important is how effective is your recovery program. And this recovery program is only possible when you have robust data backup. So I would like to focus on business continuity and IT disaster recovery. This is a huge area of opportunity. In fact, when it comes to healthcare, we have an opportunity to follow or adopt some best practices. Even though the healthcare companies, they've been doing some work from Joint Commission, and they are able to handle a lot of natural disasters, but in today's world, there could be a lot of attacks coming from some malicious software. Some network outages may happen. Think about 2 weeks back, there was a major internet outage that happened across the entire country, right? How do we, as companies, how do we be more prepared so that we are not reactive and take some proactive steps? So there are definitely some opportunities. The challenges with healthcare companies, we have huge number of legacy electronic applications. And again, if you look at our data backup, it is a real challenge in most of the healthcare companies. In fact, I wanted to highlight clinics and physician practices. In fact, when you look at clinics and physician practices, they are more vulnerable than hospital systems because they may not even have a reasonable backup. And even if they have backup, they may not have conducted any testing to see if the backups are working. And we do not want to discover that some major disaster happens and we discover we are not able to restore our systems and operations. So again, it comes back to resources and also what cyber practices we have. Again, the mitigations, the organizations really must invest in these programs in terms of bringing the necessary level of awareness among the leadership and also the funding, bringing the right resources in terms of building some reasonable and robust programs here. And the companies also should think about implementing some independent governance and monitoring. It's very important to see where your business continuity program, where your IT disaster recovery program is. You may have to engage your internal audit, your compliance or risk management team to see if you have reasonable program. And the last one is consider bringing industry experts. If you think about banking, financial, or telecom industry, they have made significant progress in this area. Companies should think about bringing some industry experts from other industry in building this program. The next area is how companies are moving forward with remediation of security risks. Again, if you look at the healthcare companies, this is across the board. The companies are faced with limited funding to support security projects. They also see increased amount of security risk because healthcare companies are more vulnerable. It is easy for malicious users to go after healthcare companies. And we also see decreased operating margin in the healthcare companies. And then when you see from the challenges perspective, again, we have legacy systems, huge number of medical devices. If you think about a company like CHI, we are talking about 60 to 70,000 medical devices in our network. So when you think about each medical device, it is a risk. If you do not properly configure the system, they can become a point of failure and they can introduce some risk into the entire network. And the next area is the emerging technologies. If you look at, again, the healthcare, for the past several years, we were so behind other industries, at least 4 or 5 years behind healthcare or telecom, financial industry or telecom. But today, healthcare is one of the fastest growing industry from the technology perspective. Think about, the huge number of mobile applications we have. Think about health information exchange, the electronic health record systems. It is amazing the growth we are seeing. But the challenge is healthcare organizations do not have the ability to attract qualified support personnel to maintain IT systems to provide the right level of security. The last one is mitigation for this area. When we talk about security and remediation of risk, organizations have to think about how we can make use of resources effectively. Suppose if we allocate funding for security, we have to make sure that the security organization is fully accountable in demonstrating the right level of security controls. They make sure that they address the risk, they balance the risk. They have to prioritize the risk so that we can minimize the risk for an organization. And information security is a journey. There are hundreds and thousands of security risks in any large organization. So you have to think about how you can establish an ongoing remediation program so that you can continue to create a strong security posture. The next area is mergers and acquisitions. Many healthcare companies we are seeing in the past several years, they've been going through a lot of consolidation. The security risk assessment during this process is absolutely critical. Many of the medium-sized organizations, they may not even have this process in place. And again, it could be because of resources and funding. The most important thing is conducting the risk assessment, but also to address security findings from these assessments. So the opportunities are, when you look at the cybersecurity risk assessment, this is the first step in building a robust security program. And again, the risk assessment should identify the critical systems, what data we have, which systems contain the most amount of patient data or employee data or confidential data, and which partners are critical, and it will help us to determine the funding support needed for the security program. Again, from the mitigation perspective, organizations should institute a pre-transaction security risk assessment, and it's very important to communicate the risks to the transaction team and ensure that funding and resources are allocated for integration efforts. Think about it. If you go and take over a company, we immediately assume all the security risks on the day of closing. It's very important that the M&A agreements also include sufficient level of security language and provisions, and we also allocate a sufficient level of funding, because if some breach has already happened, we should be in a position to handle those kind of breaches immediately. The next area is confidential data storage on cloud storage sites. Most of you are familiar with Dropbox or Box or Google Drive. These are companies that provide cloud storage opportunities for users, for companies. We are seeing an increasing practice and behavior by the clinical users in terms of using these internet-based storage sites. It provides a lot of convenience. If you're a clinical user and you work for multiple healthcare organizations, yes, it provides a lot of convenience so that you can store data in one place and you can access it from multiple locations. But this creates a risk for the organizations, because we need to control the confidential data, where it is going. And then also, if you see, Lori talked about business associate agreements. It's extremely difficult to enforce these agreements with the cloud service providers. Most of the times, they dictate what kind of business associate agreements they wanted to establish. So if you're a small or medium-sized, even large-size organization, it's very difficult to control the business associate agreements. Again, companies can think about mitigation controls. There are a lot of technical controls even small companies can institute. They can prohibit access to internet-based storage sites. Again, employee education and awareness is absolutely key. People should understand the risk of storing the data outside the network. They also should understand the consequences of storing this kind of data. And then the last important area is monitoring controls. There are some technologies and tools available, and large companies should think about implementing monitoring controls so that you can see what data is leaving your company. The next area is suppliers and business associates. Healthcare companies definitely lack maturity in this space. Again, if you look at financial industry or banking, they have a very mature program. But if you look at healthcare companies, they are moving towards increasing outsourcing activities. They're outsourcing business processes. They're outsourcing IT function. Again, their focus is to reduce the cost and achieve efficiency. Again, many companies are accessing cloud-based electronic health record systems. More and more, we are seeing any organization's patient care program is reliant upon the support we receive from our partners. Again, when you think about outsourcing huge amount of function, business process, or data to a third-party partner, you need to create the right level of oversight. Again, trust but verify. You have to trust your partner, but what kind of verification, oversight we establish for our partners? From the mitigation perspective, the most important thing I would highlight is cybersecurity insurance coverage. Think about it. If you have 100,000 records or 1 million records stored with one of your partners, and if they have a breach, we talked about it costs $350 per record. It is a huge drain from the financial perspective. It is very important that our partners and business associates carry minimum level of cybersecurity insurance coverage. The next one is business associate agreements and also security amendments. The other area we are seeing, especially when you do outsourcing, you need to know where your data is. It's very important to put some restrictions so that you control who can access the data from outside the United States. You have to make sure that your data is not leaving the United States, because if you think about the privacy controls and the legal controls in other countries, especially in Europe, it's very difficult and they are entirely different than US. So it's very important that you understand where the data is going. Without compliance, legal or privacy security approval, the data cannot leave the country. And then it's very important to establish ongoing supplier risk management program, and you have to identify what are the critical partners, where your critical data is stored, and how you can establish some level of reasonable monitoring program to make sure that they are doing the right thing.
And one of the keys I want to add here is that regardless of whether the data is with a business associate, a vendor, the Office of Civil Rights still ultimately holds us, the covered entity, CHI, accountable for the protection of that data, and if there is a breach, we will pay the fine. It will be our name in the media. Our patients will get a letter, and their trust will be compromised with us. And so that's why all of this is so very important. Now, from a governing board responsibility perspective, there are several things that we want to ask of you. First, from a query management perspective, is knowing within your organizations what are the resources available to handle all these types of issues that Ram and I have spoken about. What's the allocation for investigations, auditing, education, and remediation? The privacy officers and the security officers spend an enormous amount of time investigating events. As we talked about, under the law, every privacy event must be investigated and documented. So how are we managing that? Collaboration between departments. All of us are, quote, responsible for privacy. And all of our staff handle private, confidential, and PHI type information. So we need to coordinate together and collaborate on how we can provide good safeguards while still allowing operations to function as they should. Another key component is leadership education. Our leaders within the organizations, from the governing board down, really need to understand all the risks and know what they can do to assist us. Part of that is remaining knowledgeable about the significant changes in regulations, many of which we have presented here today, knowing what the substantial gaps are and the systems exposures related to HIPAA compliance within your organization.
Thanks, Lori. Another important thing is each organization has different level of security risks. It's very important for you to understand what are the top security risks facing healthcare organization. Each organization is unique. And also not only what risks are faced by the organizations, but whether the company is ready to handle these kind of risks. What is their readiness? What type of controls they have? What types of processes they have to handle these types of security incidents and breaches? And then the most important thing, because many companies understand the security risks and they're spending a lot of money, it's extremely important to maintain an independent security governance and monitoring. Because in the IT world, people are spending a lot of money without seeing a lot of return on investment. It's very important to balance where the money is spent, and are we addressing this towards critical risks, and are we getting the return in terms of the right level of compliance and risk mitigation steps. And the last important thing is you have to remember that security risk is an enterprise-wide risk management issue. It is not just an IT issue. So Susan, we can take any questions, comments.
Okay, we do have one question in the queue. How frequently do business associate agreements need to be updated?
Very good. I'll take that. This is Lori. So the business associate agreement statutorily only needed to be changed by the end of 2014. So when they came out originally, there was one set of verbiage that needed to go in it, and then in 2013 they required that you add a verbiage. So it really does not need to be changed every time a new scope of work is added to an underlying agreement. And the business associate agreement does not expire. It is tied to the underlying agreement. So as long as the underlying agreement is renewed, the business associate rides that. If the underlying agreement expires, the business associate agreement expires with it. So now that's what one has to do. If we have a relationship with a vendor and they originally weren't going to use or disclose PHI and we did not need a BA, and then they change focus and we engage them in a new way, we may need to then initiate a business associate agreement with them. one of the things we are trying to do with our initiative is paint with a broad enough brush in our BAs and get them up front regardless, so that if there is a change in the workflow or a new scope of engagement, we don't have to revisit that issue and we don't have a gap that we're not aware of.
Okay, thank you, Lori. And for those of you participating in the webcast, if you have a question, there was a dialog box that opened up when you signed into the webcast. Please use that to submit any questions. While we're waiting to see if I did get one more question. As a board member, can we safely expect that any very recent acquisition agreements have included appropriate language to cover the risks and issues discussed today?
Thank you, Susan. Yes, in CHI, both IT security, privacy, and of course, corporate responsibility, we work very closely with our transactions team. And we take extreme due diligence and care in terms of going through, conducting some pre-assessments, and also include sufficient language. In some cases, again, the legal team can speak to this in more detail. They make sure that there are some protections more from the financial perspective. And most important thing we do is, in addition to these contractual agreements, we also take an expedited action from security to integrate the systems, to make sure that the critical risks are immediately addressed, they're closely monitored. Sometimes it takes more than a few months to address these risks, but we have, within compliance and IT security, privacy, we have an ongoing program to monitor how the integration is progressing so that we can make sure that we are addressing critical risks.
Okay, thank you, Ram. I don't have any other questions in the queue, but I was just wondering, has CHI experienced any ransomware incidents, and if so, how are we handling those situations?
Great question, Susan. As I mentioned, no organization is immune to these types of malware incidents and attacks. What is important is how we respond to these events. So the answer is yes, CHI has experienced ransomware incidents, especially with some of the newly acquired entities. But we have a very, very methodical process. Whenever a security incident like ransomware happens, we make sure that the IT and IT security teams, they work very collaboratively with the impacted system and users. They conduct a very thorough review to determine if there is any inappropriate data leakage. They review the logs. Sometimes we also engage a third-party forensic team because it may be difficult to confirm whether the data has left the system or not. So Lori and myself, we have established a very robust process and also checklist. And once the IT security team, they closely engage corporate responsibility and also privacy to make sure that they have taken the right process to come to the low probability. So it's a very methodical process, and being a large company, in fact, Lori can speak to it from the privacy perspective.
Whenever you have a ransomware event, once security has done their analysis, they keep us in the loop from the get-go. We have to look at the event to determine, as Ron points out, was any data exfiltrated? Did it leave? Or were the hackers actually able to see the data versus just holding it hostage at a distance? And we have a very thorough process, our National Breach Response Team, which involves a cross-section of key individuals. We look at this very closely, and we make a determination if we can we get it into a safe, low probability of compromise scenario, and if we cannot, then the law compels us to notify the affected individuals, and we have a process for all of that. So it's very structured, it's very quick, because again, we have a very short time frame to work with this, and we really bring a lot of resources very quickly to bear on these events.
Okay. Well, one thing I wanted to add, Susan, Whenever a security or privacy incident happens, we also think about the root cause analysis, lessons learned, and identify what gaps we have in the system. And we make sure that we go ahead and address those gaps, security gaps, and institute additional controls. As I said, it's an ongoing journey. Every time when we identify issues, we think about what can we do to minimize these types of incidents.
Okay, thank you. One other question. How many CHI facilities have received OCR Phase 2 HIPAA audit requests?
Yes, so there have been 23 notifications received from the OCR that actually impacted 29 locations. The difference is because they sent one to the entire Franciscan health system, which ran it up from 23 to 29. So we have in the audit pool, now let me be clear, they have not yet been chosen for audit, but we have 29 physical locations within the OCR audit pool from which they can pull and choose to do an audit, whether it's a desk audit or an on-site audit. And these audits are a permanent program, so this will go into 2017 and on. As a side note, the OCR has built a pool of about 1,200 covered entities to choose from. So, you know, we're not a big fish in that pool, but nevertheless, we do have 29 physical locations from 23 letters, and we are focusing heavily on preparing those locations.
Okay, well, I know it's a lot of work, and we thank both of you and your teams for helping to prepare CHI for these activities.
Thank you, Susan.
Yes, certainly.
Okay, I don't have any more questions in the query tool. So if no more questions, I want to thank Lori and Ram for the presentation today and the information that was provided. Ram, could you go to the next slide? There you go. So this is a list of the prior webinars that have been provided to the board and board compliance committee members. This is a live these are live links on the slide, and today's webcast also has been recorded, and like I mentioned earlier, the link will be sent out later this week. So I think that's it for today. Thank you, everybody, for participating. And if any of you have a particular topic that you would like us to address on one of these quarterly webinars, please feel free to contact or send an email to Michelle Cooper at michellecooper@catholichealth.net, or you may also contact your local corporate responsibility officer and let him or her know your request. Again, thank you very much for participating in the webcast today. Thank you.